More police in Norfolk are to carry tasers. It's due to a rise in the number of assaults on officers. Amnesty International says more tasers will mean more violence. But Andy Simonds from the Norfolk Police Federation says police can't work if they're in hospital.
The level of violence is shown towards our officers is got to the stage where it's untenable. Hence the chief, and we're supporting him fully in giving more officers tasers, because we cannot continue where officers are being seriously injured.
Almost 5 to 8, Norfolk's Chief Constable and the local police federation want more of the county's police officers to carry tasers. This comes after a rise in violence towards officers in Norfolk. At the end of January, the Norfolk Police Federation told us that one of their officers is assaulted every day. Just last week, there were 2 instances of police officers being spat on by offenders with contagious diseases. That prompted Simon Bailey, the Chief Constable, to tweet that he wants his force to have the best equipment to protect themselves. He added that he will be training more officers to use taser. Let's talk more about this with Richard Taylor from Cambridge. He's been raising awareness on this issue for more than 10 years. Thanks for coming on the programme this morning. How worried are you about a possible wider spread use of tasers?
Well, I'm very concerned about it. I think that what we've got in this country with our style of policing, where we don't have an armed police force and we don't have policing by force as a matter of routine, I think that's incredibly valuable. And I think it's something that is really great about our society and our country. So I'm concerned that if we do have a rollout of taser to more officers, or even to all frontline officers, that then that sort of core aspect of our country and core aspect of our policing will change. I don't want to see policing by force to be routine. So I don't want to see at every encounter with the police, at every traffic stop, for the police to be approaching somebody either with a taser drawn or an officer with their hands sort of on their taser, ready to go.
Yeah, I don't think they're suggesting they'll do that. I think they're just saying that they're being assaulted, they're being spat on more regularly, and they feel they need to do something to protect themselves. Surely you can't disagree with that.
Well, I'm certainly very concerned by the statistic that the Chief Constable is mentioning about assaults on police officers, essentially at the rate of 1 a day. But I think we've got to remember that the police often use language in a different way to we use it in the rest of society. So an assault might not always be someone being spat at or being punched. It can also just be a glancing touch, or there might be no physical contact at all. But I want to make the job of policing safer. I want to have a safer society. But I think that the way to do that isn't to increase the amount of force that the police are going to be bringing into situations. I think we really need to solve these problems long before we get to the point of having violent confrontations on the street. I'm very concerned that of the sentences that you hear when you have assaults against police officers. Often you get very low fines, £20 or £50, or no separate penalty. I think we need to be giving much stronger penalties when we have assaults against police officers, and our court system needs to be transparent. So that's how we should be running a deterrent.
Is that more of a deterrent, though, than a police officer having access to a taser? Not necessarily using it, not necessarily approaching with it drawn, as you say, but having access to it?
Well, I certainly think in a civilised society we need to be looking at the root causes of this problem. So we need to also be looking at things like drug addiction and getting people easy access to help for that, because the vast majority of people who are coming into contact with the police do have addiction problems. And I think we need to be tackling the root causes rather than responding to this issue, which definitely exists, by giving the police these taser weapons, which I'm concerned will lead to disproportionate force being used by the police in more occasions. Where we give police officers more tasers, and this has been happening across the country, we see taser being used more, and they are not nice weapons. If you get tasered, you lose control of all your muscles. You can't stop your head from falling. Your head will fall down to the floor unrestrained. And if you're on concrete or your head hits the floor, that's going to it can cause a very serious injury. And even the barbs themselves, the barbs go in through your skin. So wherever they hit you, it's a pretty serious thing. Certainly if they hit you in the face or in the eyes, it's going to cause some serious injury.
Richard Taylor, thank you. I'll be talking to Norfolk's Deputy Chief Constable after the news at 8 o'clock, and we'll put some of Richard Taylor's concerns in that direction.
BBC Radio Norfolk. This is Chris Goreham at Breakfast.
This morning we're asking if more frontline police officers in Norfolk should be armed with tasers. Norfolk's Chief Constable has come out fairly strongly on this, saying that they should. It follows more attacks on the county's police in recent days, including 2 separate incidents where offenders with contagious diseases have spat on officers. Simon Bailey says he wants his police force to have the best equipment to protect themselves and that he will be training more officers to use tasers. It's a move that is supported by the Norfolk Police Federation. Andy Simonds is its chair, and he joined us on the programme earlier.
71% of people that responded to that poll said that it was acceptable for police officers to carry taser. The community understand that the threat that police officers face now, and also that they want to know that police officers are being deployed with the right equipment rather than waiting for officers that might be further afield to come that have got the equipment. And that protects those people that are phoning the job in. Look, there's someone with a knife in the street. We want officers going to that. They've got the equipment to actually deal with it to keep the public safe as well.
Not everyone is happy with a widespread move to arm more officers with tasers. Campaign groups and individuals have been calling for a restriction in use for many years. There have been deaths and serious injuries linked to police use of tasers. Court cases in other parts of the country have seen judges rule that police forces have used tasers excessively and disproportionately. One organisation which isn't keen on the introduction of more tasers is Amnesty International UK. Their arms and policing programme director is Oliver Sprague, and he joins us on the line now. Morning, thanks for coming on.
Morning, Chris.
Now, tasers, let's talk about the issue very generally, first of all. What is your take on tasers as an item that police could carry?
I think Amnesty quite often gets misunderstood in the public on this issue. We're not opposed to the weapon. We think in certain circumstances it can be a very useful tool. And it's important to remember that it was introduced into UK policing because it had a specific capability, which was it was able to deal with incidents of very serious violence at a safer distance for officers. It was safer for the officer, and it was safer for the individual. So when used in that context, when it's used in very dangerous situations, it can be very useful.
Yeah. Is your issue then with the idea that tasers should be used as a deterrent, that just their very existence might stop people from spitting on police officers, assaulting police officers?
The issue is that the way to keep this weapon safe. Now, you mentioned at the beginning of your piece here that taser itself is not a risk-free weapon. You know, the government's own safety advice that's widely available suggests that they can be lethal when misused, and they pose particular risks when used because they're a weapon that can cause extreme pain and discomfort. So there's a pain and psychological impact to them as well, and there's a specific risk that they pose to vulnerable groups, say, for example, young people, the elderly, or people with mental health conditions. So that is why the UK has kept weapons, firearms, tasers, etc., in the hands of very, very specialist and highly trained officers. Now, we think that's the best way to keep it safe. Now, if you look at what's happened with taser use in the UK, whilst there has been a number of incidents of concern, the number of deaths linked to taser is very, very small indeed. I think it's 2. There's a couple of inquests still outstanding, but we are talking a very, very small number of very tragic incidents, of course, but they're small. In the United States, where the weapon is routinely given to everybody, we see that hundreds and hundreds of times worse. We see the standards on when the weapon is used incredibly low. We see it routinely misused. The death count after being tasered in America is well over 500 now, and in a significant number of those cases, when Amnesty has looked at the case notes and the medical records, and our experts have looked over it, we found that it was taser that contributed to the deaths. And we see some I'm sorry to use the pun, but we see some shocking examples of taser being misused for incredibly routine and mundane offences. Now, we think that the best way to keep this weapon safe is to still keep it in the hands of specialist trained officers, and we have a very, very real concern that the more you give it out, the lower the standards become.
But more police officers are being assaulted, not necessarily physically, but some are being spat at. They say they need more protection. I'm sure you don't want to see police officers carrying guns, so isn't a taser a sort of acceptable halfway house in terms of protecting police officers, but also not having them carry guns?
It already is an acceptable halfway house, because it's been acknowledged that, outside of the firearms community, there is a case for training up officers frontline officers that are specially trained to deal with serious violent incidences. We're talking about knife crime, we're talking about weapon crime, we're talking about very, very violent individuals, to get the right police in the right situation and have the highest trained and most professional officers to do that. Now, there are two issues here. There is an issue about whether all police officers should have TASER, or whether in specific areas in the UK there is a concern because of the geographic, because of the nature, because it might be a rural area with vast distances. It might be a case that we need to look at the number of specialist officers that might be trained to use the TASER. Now, those are two very different issues. So, there is a case for looking at whether or not there are enough TASER-trained officers to ensure that each region has its quota of specially trained officers that can get to situations quickly. That's very different from saying that every officer should have a TASER. Now, that's what we're very, very concerned with.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you very much. That's Oliver Sprague from Amnesty International UK. I will just read out again the quote from Norfolk's Chief Constable on this. He's saying, "I will be training more officers to use tasers." So he's not saying that all officers will be using tasers, just to be absolutely clear on that. He's saying more, but it's not got to a situation where all will be using it. And of course, we heard from the Police Federation earlier on that there are very stringent training programs, and they're updated on an annual basis with police as well who will be using them. So what do you think? You've heard from both sides of that this morning. Certainly Norfolk Police worried about the number of assaults being carried out on their officers. In giving more of them tasers to act as a deterrent, would that work? Is it something that you think should happen? Give me a call, 01603 617 321, or does it shift the balance too far the other way in terms of the police being approachable?
BBC Radio Norfolk. This is Chris Goreham at breakfast.
8:21, Norfolk's Chief Constable says he'll be training more of his officers to use tasers. Simon Bailey has made the decision to arm more frontline officers with the stun guns after a rise in attacks on them. Last year, a poll carried out on behalf of the National Police Federation found 71% of people thought it was acceptable for officers on patrol to carry the weapon. Not everyone agrees. Earlier on the programme, we spoke to Oliver Sprague from Amnesty International UK.
We're not opposed to the weapon. We think in certain circumstances it can be a very useful tool. And the UK has kept weapons, firearms, tasers, etc., in the hands of very, very specialist and highly trained officers. Now, we think that the best way to keep this weapon safe is to still keep it in the hands of specialist trained officers. We have a very, very real concern that the more you give it out, the lower the standards become.
Well, let's find out a bit more now on this decision to train more police officers in Norfolk to use tasers. Nick Dene is the Deputy Chief Constable and joins us now. Good morning, Mr. Dene.
Good morning.
Let's just be clear about exactly what's being proposed here. You're not saying that all officers will carry tasers, are you? But when we're talking about more, I mean, how many more?
Well, at the minute, we have about 200 officers within Norfolk Constabulary who are trained with taser. We're looking to increase that by about 85 officers in the forthcoming 12 months, which actually equates to around 60 taser actual units that we would start to employ within the force.
Right. How many times have tasers been deployed in Norfolk over the last year?
Well, I think we have to get this into context. The average deployment of taser per day in January this year was around about five per day. That doesn't mean to say that we actually discharge the taser 5 times per day, but actually it's authorised by the inspectors within the control room, and it does provide that deterrent when officers are faced with a risk.
Okay, so it's not right to say that 5 times a day tasers were used in Norfolk in January.
No, I must stress that that's not the case. As I said, the average, we have a strict authorisation. I heard the earlier call in terms of ensuring standards are maintained, and I can reassure the public that standards will be maintained. Officers undergo a stringent training regime before they get issued with taser. But actually the deployments at 5 per day are the fact that the authorising officer, the inspector within the control room, feels that officers may have to use a taser because of the violence or the threat that officers face, they authorise the taser, but that certainly doesn't mean that, that the taser is deployed in terms of fired 5 times per day.
So how many times is it actually fired?
Well, it's very rare actually, because the deterrent effect of an officer pointing a taser at someone normally works, and the person does take heed of the officer's instructions. So it is very rare. If it's deployed once or twice a week, then that's about into a context.
Okay, so can you give me an example of the sort of circumstances that officers are allowed to use properly and fire a taser? Yeah,
certainly. I mean, a typical example is where an officer has been called to a male with a knife. They've been threatened, or an armed robbery that has occurred within the street. They may actually face, a person in crisis with mental health or vulnerable because of drugs or alcohol, and they're displaying violence. The overall aim of a taser is actually to reduce the risk to the person the officers are dealing with, and to increase the safety and protection of officers. So this is very much seen on both sides of the coin, both in terms of officer protection and actually in reducing to the risk and harm to the person we are actually dealing with.
Isn't the one of the issues here that if there are more tasers being carried by the police in Norfolk, then it stands to reason they will be used more often?
Well, that may be the view, but as I've just stated, officers will have to undergo a 3-day course. They undergo stringent refresher training. That's not only in actually the dealing and firing of the weapon, but also, importantly, the medical aftercare after it's been used. The actual authorisation is from an inspector within the control room, so it's not deployed at will. Certainly, officers can self-deploy if they face an immediate threat. But in the majority of cases, it's gone through some risk assessment before we use it. And even with an increase in officers carrying taser, I can reassure the public that the standards will not be dropped.
We heard from the Chief Constable, Simon Bailey, on this programme only a month ago, saying more officers with body cameras would reduce attacks. Has that idea now been abandoned? Has the police decided that actually that doesn't work and that you do need to have these tasers?
No, I think what the Chief Constable is articulating very clearly is that we have to protect our officers, and we will give them a range of equipment in order to fulfil that mission. Body worn, pava sprays, taser, the use of communication skills, officers talking to people, are all tools in the kit bag that officers use in terms of dealing with members of the public. And the vast majority of our dealings with the public are without incident. It's only in a very small minority of incidents that officers are either assaulted or we have to use such things as taser or weapons.
Nick Dene, Norfolk's Deputy Chief Constable, thank you for joining us this morning. A couple of messages on this. Mike in Great Yarmouth says everyone should be as safe as possible all the time. Members of the public, police, firemen, NHS workers. The courts don't protect us. They don't protect the police or the NHS workers. Bring in the taser. Mike is all for wider use of tasers. And another one on this, it says definitely the right thing to do. Give all our officers tasers. My family are police officers. They're getting abused and attacked regularly just for doing their job.